good. Elisha, over to you. Thank you.
Fantastic. I'm going to share my screen. Let's see. Great. Thank you so much for that introduction. I am so grateful to be here today. I'm so grateful to the Digital Democracies Institute because you create space to collaborate and tackle some of the problematic social problems of platforms, of digital platforms. And I'm also so honored to be invited by Wendy Chun as well, whose ideas inspire mine and so many others. And partly for that reason, I have been able to invite the people who whose writings I have depended on for these ideas. And I'm so grateful that so many of you have come. And I look forward to hearing your thoughts afterwards. So today my presentation seeks to trace the history of modern digital platforms, for example, Amazon, Alphabet, Meta, Tencent, and others, back to the East India companies. These companies were the corporate monoliths of their day. Karl Marx, for example, wrote op-eds about the British East India Company in the New York Tribune. Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations takes it to task. Thomas Malthus was hired to train its administrators. John Stuart Mill was its employee for over 30 years. Kant and Hegel depended on the field notes of the Dutch East India Company. And Voltaire was a shareholder in the French East India Company. In other words, these corporate monoliths inspired not only modern market logic, but also what Sylvia Wynter calls its sociogeny, Western Enlightenment notions of the human, shaped in no small part to justify these companies' winner-take-all strategies in the name of liberty, truth, and justice. In other words, what I am calling the original platform is a deeply studied archive, and my provocation aims to inspire new and old approaches to the problem of platform power. I grew up in Singapore in the 90s, and my secondary school history textbook didn't teach the history of the American Constitution or of the Normans and the Saxons. We were taught that ours was the history of a corporation. Our standardized secondary school history textbook described our pioneer administrator, quote, Raffles, a man of extraordinary vision, but for whom Singapore never would have existed. Raffles was neither a politician nor a community leader. He was a corporate executive. He worked for the British East India Company, and his extraordinary vision was one of profit. The British iteration of the East India Company was founded in 1599, the year that Shakespeare wrote Hamlet. The mayor of London gathered local merchants and politicians to start a company to break up the Dutch monopoly of the Indonesian spice trade. That's their logo on the left, the Dutch East Indies. This was an experiment with a brand new crowdsourcing model called a joint stock option company, where ordinary merchants could pool their resources in order to hedge the enormous risk of global voyage. The British East India Company, its coat of arms is on the right here, is estimated to be the 5th joint stock option company in the world in a 17th century corporate frenzy. My Singaporean history textbooks uncritically idolized the corporate bureaucrats who nursed our swampy settlements into a flourishing port because they coordinated the construction of roads, schools, military forts, and overall made the islands compatible with Western trade. We inherited the British Cambridge O-level system, which we crammed for in hopes of getting into the country's best institutions, all named after East India Company executive Sir Thomas Stamford Bingley Raffles. I just learned his middle name. I'm going to use it all the time now because it makes me laugh. Bingley Raffles Girls' School, Bingley Raffles Institution, Raffles Junior College, Raffles Hotel, where we celebrated important occasions right outside of Raffles Place subway station, where signs on the walls reminded us to speak good English. According to the autobiography of Singapore's Prime Minister of 31 years, Lee Kuan Yew, Raffles' legacy served as a symbol of the island's British heritage to make us welcome by Western governments, businesses, investments, and markets. In other words, our island was conditioned to trust that a corporation had benignly adapted our country to its markets. Against this backdrop, when I first encountered platform scholarship, it felt intimately familiar. Like, for example, Tarleton Gillespie's essay, Platforms Intervene. Platforms, quote, in their technical design, economic imperatives, regulatory frameworks, and public character have distinct consequences for what users are able to do based on explicit and implicit norms, cultural presumptions about taste and etiquette, and in ways that best suit their economic aims. Our country's explicit and implicit norms and cultural presumptions about taste and etiquette best suited the East India Company's economic aims. This explanation strikes a personal chord, illuminating, for example, my family's abandoned Chinese dialect, our deference for the British, the fact that I can't be openly transgender in Singapore thanks to the East India Company's enforcement of British Penal Code 377A. I felt the same rush of emotion when I read an essay by Ganel Langlois, Fenwick McKelvey, Greg Elmer, and Kenneth Werbin, introducing the idea of platform ontogenesis, with a quote by Marxist philosopher Maurizio Lazzarato. The corporation does not create subjects, but the world within which such subjects can exist. This is true for millions of us around the world with a shared history of Europe's economic imperatives, regulatory frameworks, and public character that prepared our countries for the agendas of corporations like the British East India Company, or the Dutch East India Company, or the Royal Africa Company, or the Hudson's Bay Company, or many other joint stock option companies founded around the same period. Here I'm trying to express in personal terms what Ezekiel Dixon Roman and Jasbir Puar call the onto-epistemology of the algorithm, or the hierarchies of human difference that continue to haunt the machine. My goal with this research is to open up platform studies 400 years back to the expertise, post-colonial studies, cultural theory, art history, and regional testimonials as authorities on the fundamental operating system of modern high-tech platforms. So my task right now is to make the case that the East India Company fulfills the definition of a platform. So I will do that by taking up 3 elements from platform studies literature: platforms, multi-sided markets, and boundary resources. And I will argue that each one was pioneered by the East India Company's design, methods, techniques, and ideologies. I take a slice of this large history to focus on a very personal case study of the company's activities in Southeast Asia, especially Singapore, which was the site of a turf war between the British and Dutch East India Companies. So to begin, platforms. The term platform was popularized by media CEO Tim O'Reilly in the fall of 2001, right after the first big dot-com bubble crash and the first real sense of disillusionment about dreams of the World Wide Web. O'Reilly launched a conference called Web 2.0, where he urged that the web is more than a place for just publishing content, but also for building infrastructure and distributed operating systems that other services could plug into for a thriving ecosystem. In what might be described as a sense of regret 2 decades later, O'Reilly and his co-authors rang alarm bells in a Vox article called "Mark Zuckerberg runs a nation state and he's the king." They cite Larry Lessig's theory that code is the law of cyberspace and warn that Facebook is a powerful sovereign and Mark Zuckerberg is the key lawgiver. Indeed, today the scale of platform power has drawn concerns about the rise of platform nations, while in the opposite political camp, business scholars urge for more platform nations, including the Singaporean business scholar, just interestingly, which brings me to my first argument, which is that the East India Company platform was its treaties. The company's first treaty was signed on the last day of the year 1600, the charter granted by Queen Elizabeth to the East India Company. This treaty gave the company the right to have, purchase, receive, possess, enjoy, and retain lands, rents, privileges, liberties, jurisdictions, franchises, and hereditaments to the governor and company of merchants of London trading into the East Indies and their successors. This treaty established the law of colonial space. For example, that, quote, "any other persons that shall trade or traffic into or from any of the said East Indies shall incur our indignation and the forfeiture and loss of goods," end quote. The formal academic study of platforms and their cultural impact was launched by Ian Bogost and Nick Montfort in a 2006 MIT Press book series called Platform Studies. Bogost and Montfort define a platform in its purest form as an abstraction, a particular standard or specification. Treaties were the East India Company's particular standards and specifications. Wendy Chun shows how software is endemic of transformations in modes of governing, that make governing both more personal and impersonal, that enable both empowerment and surveillance. The Queen's Charter was prototypical platform software, an iteration of governing remotely, geographically, temporally, personally, impersonally, empowering and surveilling through a particular standard or specification that invested a corporation with a monopoly over privilege and liberty. The East India Company signed a treaty to acquire Singapore 2 centuries later, in 1819. This historic moment was taught in Singapore in schools in cheerful pro-British textbook language as a trick that manipulated and stirred up local rivalries. When Sir Bingley Raffles arrived in Singapore, the Dutch had the main control over shipping channels because of a treaty they had made with the Sultan of Johor. And you can see on the map, this is right above modern-day Singapore, but all of this was British Malaya until 1957. However, the Sultan of Johor had an elder brother who had claimed his right to the throne. Raffles declared the elder brother as the rightful ruler. Oh, I'm sorry, the Sultan of Johor, yes, had an elder brother. No, sorry, it was his younger brother. I've mixed up this very complicated history. So his younger brother had claimed right to the throne. Raffles found the older brother, declared he was the rightful sultan on behalf of the British crown. And here he is signing a treaty with his own new sultan on a local beach with great pomp and ceremony. According to Singaporean primary school textbooks, this act of deception was a wise and prudent decision on the part of the company. The next part, though, is not mentioned in Singaporean history textbooks, and I have only discovered it thanks to indigenous Singaporean sociologists like Norman Abdullah and Syed Hussein Alatas, the latter of whom is co-editing an exciting 2021 title called Raffles Renounced that I'm hotly anticipating getting in the mail. I learned from them that the fact that the new British-endorsed Sultan of Johor was in the midst of a succession dispute, and so he was locally precarious, was an asset. The first treaty that the company made with him was modest, allowing him to retain ownership of the land and a portion of customs duties. But starting the next year, the company questioned the legitimacy of his right to collect these payments because the treaty had not been ratified by the British Supreme Court. They demanded that he repay all of that money, but then proposed to cancel his debts in return for full company control of Singapore. The Sultan resisted at first, but eventually gave in, and this might be because Raffles had given him a gift during the signing process. And this gift was part of company strategy to reduce the region to complete British dependence, and that was opium. This was part of a company playbook that facilitated trade between British India, China, Iran, and it opened the doors to Singapore, where an opioid crisis was the company's largest source of revenue for the first 100 years. I just learned this in my research about a week ago, and I'm quite emotional about it. I did not know this. The Sultan signed what was called the Treaty of Friendship and Alliance in 1824 and surrendered all of Singapore and its surrounding islands to the full authority of the East India Company. And this is the first 100 years of an opioid crisis. Langlois et al. Refer to software as code politics, the connections that enable the shape the traffic and trafficking of information, data, immaterial labor, and subjectivities. The East India Company treaties set the precedent for platform software as social, political, economic governance, shaping the traffic and trafficking of resources, immaterial labor, and subjectivities. In a section of that same paper called World Mapping, Langlois et al. Explain platforms through the methodological framework of Felix Guattari's 4 instruments of integrated world capitalism, including the semiotics of subjectivation. In other words, platform scholars already intuit that platforms inherit their power from the technologies and logics of colonial capitalism. In 2015, Dong Yao Jin published Digital Platforms, Imperialism, and Political Culture, which has been essential to me, especially his argument that Western platforms impact global social consciousness. However, his definition of imperialism is based on the writings of Vladimir Lenin, who claimed that imperialism is a stage of capitalism distinct from earlier stages because of new monopolistic corporations, unlike Karl Marx's time of small-scale enterprises. However, when he wrote Das Kapital, Marx specifically called the East India Company a monopoly. Quote, "The English East India Company, as is well known, obtained, besides the political rule in India, the exclusive monopoly of the tea trade, as well as of the Chinese trade in general, and of the transport of goods to and from Europe." Marx also wrote 15 editorials for the New York Tribune And in one of them, to my excitement, he took a dig at Raffles. He chose a quote from Raffles' book, The History of Java, which accuses the Dutch of being a capricious and guilty of the monopolizing selfishness of traders. Marx makes the point that Raffles is a lying hypocrite. Quote, British colonial rule is only an imitation of the Dutch, and so much so that in order to characterize the working of the British East India Company, it's sufficient to literally repeat what Sir Stamford Raffles, the English governor of Java, said of the old Dutch East India Company. Ha! In their Vox article about Mark Zuckerberg being king, O'Reilly and his co-authors, Henry Farrell and Margaret Levi, contemplate that in some ways, of course, quote, the comparison is inexact. Facebook doesn't have the power to tax, and it certainly doesn't have what Louis XIV called the final argument of kings, the ability to use physical violence to force people to comply with its demands, end quote. However, this was corporate strategy for over 300 years, and I am arguing that it generated the template for modern corporate enterprise. The East India companies were monopolies that battled for world domination against companies like the Muscovy Company, the Levant Company, the South Sea Company, and many other companies whose territorial disputes culminated in the 7 Years' War and the Napoleonic Wars in Europe and almost everywhere else in colonialism. In other words, I aim to argue that historians can open the black box of platform power. Okay, so number 2 of my case today, multi-sided markets. Platforms are multi-sided markets, meaning that they manage many sides, complementers, developers, advertisers, and users. To explain what they mean by this, platform scholars often quote a paper written by prestigious French economists Jean-Charles Rochet and Jean Tirole, who the latter won a Nobel Prize. Rochet and Tirole argue that platforms make money by structuring prices in a multi-sided market. So, for example, Instagram doesn't produce any content. It's produced by my friends, by advertisers, by influencers, by comedians, by news outlets, but none of these creators charge me for watching them. Instead, we all pay Instagram in money and in data. Rochet and Tirole explain that a multi-sided platform either bans or limits the bilateral setting of prices between buyer and seller and imposes constraints on pricing between end users. In a careful way that keeps everyone on board, they explain that a multi-sided market platform strikes a balanced pricing strategy in order to make money. For the East India Company, unlike uploading photos to Instagram, content took months to arrive and sometimes not at all. And so its pricing strategies were tedious, complicated, risky, and extremely well documented by art, literary, and economic historians. For example, Kirti Chowdhury, who explains that directors would consult company sales figures, rates of profitability, and the level of the auction bids of their Western buyers. Literary scholar Jiming Yang describes these Western buyers, collectors, tailors, designers, grocers, artists, and maybe early influencers like Edmund Waller, a poet who wrote about the Queen's adoption of the fashionable new tea trade. East India Company would send shipboard business agents on its supercargoes to oversee the mechanics of multi-sided markets with Eastern complementers, including trade merchants and officials, who they would often bribe. Leanna Lee Whitman carefully studied records of these pricing strategies, which are housed at the London India Office Library and Records, Foreign and Commonwealth Office. Other prominent complementers as part of this multi-sided market, especially in the Port of Singapore, included the Dutch railway companies like KPM and NIS, and the Royal Dutch Company for Exploitation of Oil Wells in the Dutch Indies, which merged with a British shipping company in 1907 to become Shell, mostly because that British company had earned its fortune from a massive Asian shell decorating craze, like this cottage built for Marie Antoinette. Another complementer was plantations, which was a European technology imported by private plantation owners. Anne Laura Stoller studied the Indonesian tobacco plantations of Jacob Theodore Kramer and records that he made Chinese coolies work under such a brutal mode of production that a quarter of them died. In 1928, a statue of Kramer was erected in front of the Delhi Plantation Association. This is Delhi, Indonesia, not Delhi, India, with the inscription, Kramer, 1847 to 1923, the founder of Delhi tobacco plantations, the founder of the railway in Delhi, a tireless warrior who worked for the benefit of this plantation country. Terms like founder and plantation country testify to how the logic of Dutch and British treaties, trade partners, and infrastructures produced labels, ranking systems, and rules in what Dixon, Roman, and Puar call a recursive reconfiguration of being. Kramer created a plantation country that Indonesians and local diasporas became so that he could be their founder. In an era of contested statutes, this one is not. In fact, last year, the Indonesian government welcomed an apology from the Dutch government, but the apology only acknowledged a period of 4 years after World War II, in which Dutch forces used torture tactics in an attempt to regain their control over the country after the war. A local Indonesian academic op-ed remarked that the apology should have mentioned 350 years, but that this history is redacted from both Indonesian and Dutch education, completing what Puar and Dixon Roman call a recursive reconfiguration of being. In British Malaya, imported complementers included labor intermediaries like the Chinese triads who imported paid or indentured Chinese laborers to Singapore, which was essential to the company since Europeans were not able to access Chinese workers. Indian labor intermediaries, including private coolie recruiting firms and the Kangani system, as two examples of complementers. These private coolie recruiting firms easily enslaved indentured Bangladeshis after company rule in Bangladesh oversaw 15 successive unmitigated famines. Emery Core shows how these firms restricted labor supply for higher commission and selected lowest caste workers who were considered more pliant. This is an image of a rubber plantation in British Malaya. And when they arrived in Singapore, coolies were subject to impossible labor bonds and repayment systems, causing violence and starvation. This was deemed illegal by the company in 1910 because plantation owners lobbied that they were losing money, since as many as 60 to 90% of the laborers died within a year of arrival. This led to a third labor intermediary, the Kangani system, which is usually a laborer already employed by the plantation sent to recruit others from his village. Core describes how Kanganis became shopkeepers, moneylenders, and overseers who were paid head money for each day that each laborer worked. This created internally controlled hierarchies, which was one of the many strategies that plantation owners shared with each other through the progenitors of perhaps the website Meta for Business, which gives advice to how to make your business thrive. For example, the Selangor Journal, which still exists, but in the 19th century was a colonial newsletter. Quote, to secure your independence, work with Javanese, that's modern day Indonesians, and Tamils. And if you have sufficient experience, also with Malays and Chinese. You can then always play the one against the other, and as the different nationalities never agree with each other, one will watch and control and compete against the other. In case of a strike, you will never be left entirely without labor, and the coolies of one nationality will think twice before they make their terms if they know that you are in such a position that you can do without them. These divide and conquer racial ranking systems secured the revenue of plantation owners as an adaptation to the East India Company's fluctuating pricing systems. In other words, the company designed the original multi-sided market platform by preventing the bilateral setting of prices between end users, while their treaties, taxes, and licenses imposed delicately weighted constraints that kept all complementers on board. Okay, my final argument, boundary resources. This is going to be broken in two. In 2012, platform scholar Ahmed Ghazaneh published the greatest PhD dissertation that was so widely cited because it is indispensable for illuminating how platform power emerges from interoperable boundary resources. He and the many who cite him refer to the boundary object theory of Susan Lee Starr and James R. Greismer. Starr and Greismer explain that boundary objects are tools that bridge knowledge across different disciplines and social worlds. They studied natural history museums, some of which struggled to establish scientific authority because they were originally cabinets of curiosities of wealthy collectors, which was a cultural phenomenon that emerged from East India Company trade. These collectors bought imports of flora, fauna, and human remains based on a whim. In order to transition these cabinets to science, the owners had to identify specific objects amongst the collections that resonated with this new field of archaeology and science, for example, maps and field notes. So these are boundary objects, and they are the product of a shrewd, enterprising agenda. In fact, Starr and Greismer's idea is based on another study. This is the last step of my rabbit hole right now, by Bruno Latour, Michel Calon, and John Law, about how business entrepreneurs establish themselves as scientific gatekeepers. Entrepreneurs would select objects that are meaningful to a range of stakeholders in order to drive home the value of their enterprise. In this sense, the concept of a boundary object is based on a colonial project to convert global trade domination into scientific authority. So, Gazawana breaks platform boundary resources into two categories, APIs and SDKs, and I will now talk about APIs. Application Programming Interfaces, or APIs, have the clearest definition that I've read from an article by Jean-Christophe Plantin, Carl Lagos, Paulin Edwards, and Christian Sandvik. Quote, like electrical sockets, APIs permit other programs to plug in order to exchange data or perform other functions. Unlike electrical sockets, however, APIs create a two-way flow of data. An API is a gateway permitting other systems to interact with platforms to form a seamlessly interactive network. Based on this explanation of an API, I would include Singapore's roads as a trade infrastructure for transporting goods permitting other systems to interact with company treaties. In fact, colonial apologists, including my childhood textbook, argue that colonialism was good because it replaced our 650,000 square yards of tropical swamp with these usable trade gateways. However, Plantin et al. Continue that platform boundary resources are not the same as real-world infrastructures, which is a mid-century ideal of centrally regulated essential services that make cities coherent units responsible for providing certain services to all citizens. On the other hand, they argue digital platforms represent a transformation of a traditional monopoly infrastructure model into the deregulated, privatized, and splintered, or we might say platformized infrastructure model, where services splintered among many for-profit providers and many low-income citizens remain excluded. The joke's on them, because in our colonies, our infrastructural model was always deregulated, privatized, and splintered, or we might say platformized for centuries. In fact, Plantin et al. Cite the infrastructural ideal of Steve Graham and Simon Marvin, whose book Splintering Urbanisms pays little attention to colonialism, except to describe it in terms of international aid efforts to modernize developing countries, which is a view that has been discredited, including by my East India Company Platform Studies colleague, Rigby Ali. In Singapore, as with all of their territories, the company built infrastructures by putting contracts out to tender, not to serve the public, but in fact to serve a manufactured opioid crisis that boosted trade between plantation owners, dealers, and dens, all of whom paid the company for an opium license in a seamlessly interactive network. I will now give two more examples of the groundwork for modern APIs, maps and the slave trade. The East India Company's very first mapping project was in 1680, map of the Great River Ganges. This is it. This map was based on a sketch made by a company administrator in India, and this was then shipped to London, where another company administrator walked down to the north bank of the Thames to find local map makers who plied their trade in streets and alleys. John Thornton was selected and given a sketch, and he had also engraved a map of America, and that's this, a few years earlier for the Hudson's Bay Company. In the end, the map of the Great River Ganges was engraved in a London alleyway by a private businessman who had never seen India. This map was used to define territorial claims, military projects, and ethnic divides, and also enabled the East India Company's multi-sided markets to plug in, exchange resources, and perform other functions in a two-way flow of data, building forts, moving weapons, importing and exporting goods, and always interacting with the company treaties, since all customs, taxes, and tolls always went back to the company in a seamlessly interactive network as an original API. A second example of an API that I will suggest is the company's essential business resource of slavery. Before Raffles arrived in Singapore and Indonesia, the British government had passed a Slave Trade Felony Act. As the Lieutenant Governor of Bencoolen, Raffles protested this felony act could not have been intended for his territories, since this law was passed before they were established, which this logic is beyond me. It was important for him to maintain the slave trade as a lingua franca between many complementers. But he was also keen to fall in line with the humanitarian appearance of abolition movements in England. And so, like an early virtue signal, he increased the import on duty on slaves. He also legislated that they must be children. No slaves could be imported who were older than 14 years old. This was the reintroduction of an older Dutch East India Company rule that Raffles believed made him appear compassionate because of the principle that these slaves would be broken in while they were still small, quote, in Raffles' words, that period of life when the change cannot be felt and the misfortune is not remembered. This quote comes from a letter that he wrote to his boss, the Governor General of India, Lord Minto, who might sound familiar, he had just been the Governor General of Canada, in which he blamed slavery on the Dutch, but argued that at this point, the trade could not be abolished. The following is a somewhat long excerpt from his letter to Lord Minto, and I included to illustrate Raffles as an entrepreneur, arguing that the conduit of slave trade is a crucial business unifier as an object that shares cultural, legal, and scientific common sense. The native ports and chiefs in Java and in the eastern seas, though in many cases powerful and of ancient date, are so far removed from civilization that the comforts to be derived from the attention of domestic servants are unknown to them. The Dutch, therefore, had to create a class of domestic servants, and in doing this, they adopted the plan of raising children in their families from other countries, in preference to those in their more immediate neighborhood, who from their connections and the habits of their relatives could never be depended on. The sudden change of condition from actual slavery to unlimited freedom has no doubt in many instances tended rather to destroy than improve their morals, and it's rather to the gradual and slow operation of the change in the general condition of the slave that we are to look forward for benefit than from any partial or immediate emancipation. This letter was prompted by a specific event in which the East India Company had identified a slave trader's ship docked in Bali, Indonesia, containing 116 children from Jakarta. According to the Felony Act, this was illegal, but Raffles was keen to endorse its passage because the resource of slavery had already been codified into his cost-benefit analysis. Raffles is rationalizing in what George Steinmetz describes as the muting of the capitalist crisis, which made it increasingly plausible that social practices really were repeatable in ways that could be captured by statistical models. Historian H.R.C. Wright insists that high office compelled Raffles to grapple with practical problems. This map of modern global slavery, I will come back to that quote. This map of modern global slavery, which is somewhat politicized by the American State Department, nonetheless invokes a robust, ongoing trade today that Kate Crawford and others have revealed is still instituted into the supply chains, pricing strategies, and statistical models of high-tech platforms today. This is what Ezekiel Dixon-Roman calls algoritmo, the algorithm as a racialized assemblage of the ongoing social political ontology of humans, not quite humans, and non-humans. When Raffles urges that the slave trade is a culturally cultivated, scientifically sound, and morally upright passageway, he preserves it as what Plantin calls a gateway, permitting other systems to interact with platforms to form a seamlessly interactive network. All right, my final argument, SDKs. Software development kits, or SDKs, are toolkits that help developers make their services more compatible with a platform. Christina Alaimo gives examples of SDKs like community rules and regulations, business tools, and other governance mechanisms that can take the form of code libraries, previous documentation, and sample code. The British East India Company provided all of this through its private training schools, including the East India Company College in England and the Anglo-Oriental College in Malaya, as well as its dissemination of liberal ideology through these colleges and elsewhere. The East India Company College was established in 1806, 19 miles north of London. One of the professors with the longest tenure was Thomas Malthus, who taught there from 1805 to 1834. For this reason, Malthusian economics and population theory strongly influenced the company's governance mechanisms, especially during times of famine. Malthus taught that famine is an inevitable solution to scarcity and must not be mitigated, or it would produce an unsustainable population of dependent people. As a direct result, British administrators refused and blocked famine relief around the world, including during the Irish potato famine and the many successive famines caused by droughts in India, and worsened by extreme company taxation that often increased during droughts to compensate for profit loss. For example, Sir George Cooper, who administered in India starting in 1846, declared, "If we are to secure that a class of men so low in intellect, morality, and possessions as to be absolutely independent of natural population checks, shall be protected from every cause such as famine or sickness, which tends to restrain their numbers by an abnormal mortality, they must end up by eating every other class in the community. This very Malthusian quote demonstrates how Thomas Malthus and the East India Company college professors offered SDKs that prepared administrators to develop infrastructures in alignment with company treaties. Meanwhile, in the colonies, company officials set up regional schools for training future administrators, or if you will, local developers. One of Raffles' first projects was to establish such schools in Singapore and in Malacca, and his meeting notes are free online and very well preserved by Singapore's National Library. At a first meeting of principal inhabitants of Singapore, Raffles outlines his vision for a local curriculum. I will just quote some of it. The object of our stations being confined to the protection and encouragement of free, unrestricted commerce with the whole of these countries, and our establishments being on that footing and principles, no jealousy can exist where we make our inquiries. When the man of science inquires for the mineral or vegetable productions of any particular country, or the manner in which the fields are cultivated or the mines worked, no motive will exist for withholding information. But if in return we are anxious and ready to disseminate the superior knowledge we ourselves possess, how much shall we increase this readiness and desire on the part of the natives, and what may not be the extent of the blessings we may in exchange confer on these extensive regions? I believe this articulates the logic of a software development kit. Meanwhile, in her analysis of early colonial textbooks in Singapore, digital humanities scholar Adeline Coe describes how this education produced divisive ranking systems. Coe describes how this hierarchy produced local elites taught Victorian upper class distinction, such as, quote, notions of being from a correct background, and through the idea of team sports, such as cricket and polo, notions of fair play and being a good sport, end quote. This is an image of the inaugural winners of the Queen's Scholarship, which sent outstanding Singaporean students to British universities. Finally, my final third proto-SDK, consider the circulation of British liberal ideas, embodied by the works of Adam Smith and John Stuart Mill. Smith published The Wealth of Nations in 1776, which heavily critiqued the East India Company. For example, quote, the difference between the genius of the British Constitution, which protects and governs North America, and that of the mercantile company oppresses and domineers in the East Indies. This quote is obviously only relevant to the well-being of European subjects in either of those places. Furthermore, it's confusing for a number of reasons, but furthermore, his opposition here is based on the principle that mercantile monopoly is evil because it is economically inefficient and interferes with the invisible hand of the market. He then urges the company to push forward with its moral accomplishments of, quote, defense, justice, and public works, which facilitate commerce in general, consistent with the perfect system of natural liberty and justice, end quote. This seeming paradox of mercantile agendas as both a source of oppression and domination and natural liberty and justice is ironed out a century later by John Stuart Mill. His father wrote a popular history of company rule in India, which denounced Indian morality, and according to a number of historians, shaped the negative attitudes of many East India Company administrators. John Stuart Mill Jr. started spreading similar ideas in pamphlets starting from age 17, which was the year that he was sent to India to take a position as an administrator, where he stayed for 30 years. Mill's liberal Bible on Liberty was published the same year that he authored the 1858 East India Company petition to Parliament, which aimed to absolve the company of the mismanagement of the 1857 Indian Rebellion. This mismanagement was in fact a sadistic 2-week-long massacre as a retribution for the rebellion of the company's Indian army. Mill's petition failed and the East India Company was broken up and nationalized under Crown rule. Lisa Lowe shows how Mill guided the company to calculate its imports exclusively by what it cost the company to produce, while excluding costs like local death rates, for example. She argues that the modern distinction, quote, this is a quote, between definitions of the human and those to whom such definitions do not extend is the condition of possibility for Western liberalism. In other words, racist hierarchies are not a mistake that can be fixed by liberal solutions. They are the premise of liberalism itself. And this is her book's thesis. In this vein, I am arguing that liberalism is an original East India Company SDK, or, quote, the community rules and regulations, business tools, and other governance mechanisms that train potential developers to align their services within the platform's goals. I will now conclude. My goal is to argue that modern platforms do not invent their modern operating systems and logics, but inherit them. My research is indebted to the work of computation scholars who already take an anti-colonial lens by showing how racial capitalism is integral to modern algorithms and how data infrastructures, artificial intelligence, and machine learning are grounded in the logics of racialized assemblages. Like these writers, many platform studies scholars do intuit that platforms benefit from a longer colonial history. And some of these include, as I've mentioned, Ezekiel Dixon-Roman, Wendy Chun, Simone Brown, Abiba Berhane, and others. I am arguing, and my goal today really is to offer specificity. I'm arguing to open up platform studies to 400 years of specific history, and my case study of Southeast Asia aims to offer a framework that can be repeated in many regions in many ways for attributing the problems of modern platforms, including lateral violence, ranking systems, coercive pricing strategies, and so on, to a long, specific timeline. Bogos and Montfort established platform studies and calls for scholars to take platforms seriously as the program infrastructures that influence culture. They called for a technical rigor and in-depth investigation of how computing technologies work. And my research seeks to respond with fidelity and precision. Evocatively, as you can see here, in 2017, British Parliament was ridiculed for introducing the idea of Empire 2.0 as their aspiration to improve trade links with Commonwealth nations after Brexit. However, I believe this is useful associative thinking on their part. Web 2.0 is not new. It is a continuation of traditional empire, which was run by corporate monopolies. I look forward to exploring platform power through colonial scholarship and local testimony. And I would also like to invite anyone who's interested to a lab that I've started here at Penn called the East India Company Platform Studies. And I'll put a link to it in the chat, which includes all of my sources. This website includes all of my sources for today. Thank you so much.